before cigarettes, cigars, or even written history, someone picked up a burning plant, breathed its smoke into their lungs, and unknowingly started a habit that would outlive entire civilizations. The strangest part is that this wasn't just about getting high or satisfying curiosity. For thousands of years, smoke was believed to carry prayers, heal diseases, reveal hidden worlds, and connect humans with forces they couldn't explain. So when did ancient humans actually start smoking? The answer reaches much deeper into the past than most people imagine. The earliest evidence doesn't begin with tobacco. It begins with fire itself. Once humans learned to control fire hundreds of thousands of years ago, they were constantly surrounded by smoke. Cooking, warmth, protection from predators, and clearing land all filled the air with burning plants. Archaeologists know that prehistoric people inhaled smoke every single day simply because fire became central to survival. But accidentally, breathing smoke and intentionally smoking plants are two very different things. At some point, curiosity took over. People noticed that certain leaves, bark, seeds, and herbs produced unusual smells, strange dreams, or calming sensations when burned. That observation would change human culture forever. What makes this story so fascinating is that smoking wasn't invented in one place. Different societies separated by oceans discovered their own smoking traditions using completely different plants. While one civilization burned tobacco, another inhaled cannabis, another experimented with juniper, and others used aromatic herbs during rituals. Human beings kept arriving at the same idea independently. Burn a plant, breathe the smoke, see what happens. If you traveled back 400,000 years, you would find early humans sitting around controlled fires. Species like Homo heidelbergensis, and later the Neanderthals, had already learned how to manage fire, using it for warmth, protection from predators, cooking, and light. Smoke was an unavoidable part of daily life, filling caves and shelters whenever wood burned. But living around smoke isn't the same as smoking. Archaeologists have found no convincing evidence that these early humans intentionally inhaled smoke for pleasure or ritual. In fact, constant exposure probably damaged their lungs rather than benefiting them. Their relationship with smoke was practical, not recreational. Still, something important was happening. Human brains were becoming increasingly aware of how different plants behaved when burned. Some woods smelled sweet. Others produced thick clouds that repelled insects. Certain herbs created unusual aromas that lingered long after the fire faded. Without realizing it, ancient people were building generations of knowledge about the invisible effects of smoke. That curiosity would eventually lead somewhere entirely unexpected. The oldest strong evidence for intentional smoking doesn't come from Europe or the Middle East. It comes from the Americas, where tobacco evolved naturally long before humans arrived. Wild tobacco belongs to the Nicotiana genus, a group of plants rich in nicotine. Unlike many edible plants, tobacco wasn't attractive because of its taste. Its chemical compounds were actually designed to discourage animals from eating it. Yet humans discovered something different. When its leaves were dried and burned, inhaling the smoke produced powerful physical and mental effects. For decades, archaeologists debated exactly when this discovery happened. The answer remained frustratingly out of reach because smoke itself leaves almost no trace. Ash disappears, organic matter decays, and ancient pipes rarely preserve enough residue for chemical analysis. Then, new evidence began to emerge from carefully excavated sites in North America. Tiny traces of nicotine trapped inside ancient smoking implements suggested that people were using tobacco far earlier than anyone had imagined. The timeline of smoking suddenly shifted back by thousands of years. One discovery from the Utah desert forced historians to rethink nearly everything they believed about the origins of smoking. At a site used by hunter-gatherers roughly 12,000 years ago, archaeologists uncovered charred wild tobacco seeds alongside stone tools and the remains of ancient hearths. These weren't random plants blown into a campsite by the wind. The seeds showed signs that humans had deliberately collected and handled them. This finding pushed the known relationship between humans and tobacco to the very end of the last ice age. At that point, agriculture didn't even exist. These people weren't farmers growing tobacco fields. They were highly mobile hunter-gatherers, moving across changing landscapes while experimenting with the natural world around them. Did they smoke the leaves? Chew the plant? Burn it during ceremonies? The seeds alone cannot answer every question, but their presence demonstrates something remarkable. Humans recognized tobacco as a special plant thousands of years before permanent villages or written history appeared. And that's only the beginning. Evidence from later periods becomes even more convincing, revealing that smoking wasn't simply a habit. It was becoming something sacred. The next discoveries uncover ancient pipes, powerful shamans, and rituals where smoke was believed to carry human prayers directly into the sky. By around 5,000 years ago, smoking had evolved into something far more deliberate. Archaeologists began uncovering stone pipes across parts of North America, many of them carefully carved rather than hastily shaped. These objects weren't everyday cooking tools or weapons. They were designed for a very specific purpose. Chemical analysis of residue trapped inside several ancient pipes has detected nicotine, providing direct evidence that tobacco was being burned and inhaled. This was a breakthrough. Instead of guessing from scattered plant remains, researchers could now connect the act of smoking to physical artifacts made by human hands. You might picture these pipes looking like the long ceremonial ones seen in movies, but the earliest examples were often much smaller and simpler. Function mattered more than decoration. Even so, crafting a pipe required time and skill, suggesting that smoking had already become an established cultural practice rather than a passing experiment. Once people had portable tools for smoking, the experience changed completely. Fire was no longer limited to a campfire. Smoke could be carried, shared, and repeated wherever communities gathered. Not everyone smoked. In many ancient societies throughout the Americas, tobacco was treated as a powerful substance reserved for specific individuals or important occasions. The people most closely associated with it were often shamans, healers, or spiritual leaders who believed smoke could bridge the visible world and the unseen one. For these practitioners, tobacco wasn't a recreational escape. It was a tool. Before ceremonies, they might fast, chant, or prepare special mixtures of plants. Smoking was only one part of a much larger ritual meant to communicate with ancestors, seek guidance, or diagnose illness. Ethnographic records collected centuries later from indigenous communities describe tobacco as a sacred gift rather than an ordinary crop. While traditions varied enormously from one culture to another, a common thread appears again and again. Smoke was thought to carry intentions upward, reaching spirits in ways spoken words could not. That idea transformed smoking into something much greater than inhaling burned leaves. Every breath could carry meaning. Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Ancient smokers weren't always using tobacco alone. Archaeological evidence and historical accounts suggest that people experimented with an astonishing variety of plants, each chosen for different purposes. Some herbs produced calming effects. Others created vivid dreams or heightened awareness. In parts of South America, certain ceremonial mixtures included plants containing psychoactive compounds far stronger than nicotine. Elsewhere, aromatic leaves and tree resins were burned simply because their fragrant smoke purified ritual spaces or masked unpleasant odors. The exact recipes were often guarded knowledge, passed from one generation of spiritual specialists to the next. A mixture that healed in one community might never appear in another only a few hundred miles away. Local ecosystems shaped local traditions. This tells you something important about ancient humans. They weren't blindly burning random plants to see what happened. Over countless generations they observed, experimented, remembered, and refined their knowledge. What looked like simple smoke often represented centuries of accumulated experience. And while the Americas were developing rich smoking traditions centered on tobacco, civilizations on the other side of the world were creating their own remarkable relationships with smoke, without tobacco ever entering the picture. The next chapter takes us into the temples of Egypt, the palaces of Mesopotamia, and the shrines of Asia, where fragrant smoke became one of humanity's oldest forms of worship. While tobacco remained exclusive to the Americas for thousands of years, ancient civilizations across Africa, Europe, and Asia had already discovered that smoke could transform an ordinary space into something that felt sacred. In ancient Egypt, Priests burned fragrant resins such as frankincense and myrrh every day inside temples. Thick clouds of aromatic smoke drifted through massive stone halls as offerings were presented to the gods. The smoke wasn't meant to be inhaled in the same way tobacco smoke would be centuries later, but people standing nearby naturally breathed it in throughout these ceremonies. The Egyptians believed the rising smoke carried prayers into the heavens while also purifying the temple itself. Certain resins were imported from distant lands, making them incredibly valuable. Entire trade routes developed to satisfy the growing demand for these precious aromatics. You can almost imagine the scene. Golden sunlight filtering through towering columns, priests moving in silence, the scent of burning resin filling every corner of the sanctuary. Smoke had become more than a byproduct of fire. It had become part of communication between humans and the divine. Farther east, another ancient civilization was developing its own traditions around smoke. In Mesopotamia, one of the world's earliest centers of urban life, temples regularly burned cedar, cypress, juniper, and aromatic resins during religious ceremonies. Clay tablets describe offerings made to deities, many of which included fragrant materials placed onto burning coals. The purpose wasn't recreation, it was symbolism. Pleasant-smelling smoke represented purity, reverence, and devotion. The rising columns of vapor became visual reminders of prayers ascending toward the heavens. These practices gradually influenced neighboring cultures. Across the ancient Near East, smoke became woven into religious life, appearing in ceremonies, festivals, and royal rituals. Although tobacco was still completely unknown outside the Americas, humans everywhere seemed to reach a similar conclusion. Smoke possessed an unusual ability to change how people experienced a place, a moment, or a spiritual event. Different plants, different beliefs, yet a remarkably similar instinct. Thousands of years later, smoking would finally leave the Americas, but not because ancient civilizations discovered tobacco on their own. Everything changed after Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492. European explorers encountered indigenous communities, using tobacco in ways they had never witnessed before. Some people smoked rolled leaves, others used carved pipes. In several regions, tobacco played an essential role in diplomacy, healing ceremonies, and religious traditions. At first, many Europeans reacted with confusion. Watching someone deliberately inhale smoke seemed strange, even unsettling. Some explorers believed the practice was a curiosity unique to the people they had encountered. They had no idea they were witnessing the beginning of one of the most influential cultural exchanges in human history. Within just a few decades, tobacco seeds crossed the Atlantic. Portuguese and Spanish traders introduced the plant to Europe, where it spread with astonishing speed. Physicians debated its medicinal value. Nobles embraced it as a fashionable novelty. Merchants realized its enormous commercial potential. The practice that had developed over thousands of years among indigenous peoples was suddenly moving across continents faster than anyone could have imagined. And what happened next would reshape economies, fuel global trade, spark political conflicts, and ultimately create one of the most widespread human habits ever recorded. By the early 1600s, tobacco had become one of the world's most valuable commodities. European colonies in the Americas rapidly expanded tobacco cultivation to satisfy an exploding demand back home. What had once been a sacred plant used selectively in ceremonies was transformed into a massive cash crop. The consequences reached far beyond smoking itself. Vast plantations spread across fertile land, and tobacco became deeply tied to the transatlantic economy. Its profitability drove colonial expansion and contributed to the growth of the Atlantic slave trade, as enslaved Africans were forced to cultivate and process tobacco under brutal conditions. At the same time, attitudes toward smoking varied dramatically. Some rulers embraced it, believing tobacco had medicinal benefits. Others saw it as a dangerous foreign habit. In the early 1600s, England's King James I famously condemned tobacco in his treatise A Counterblast to Tobacco, describing smoking as offensive to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs. Despite royal criticism, consumption continued to rise. Humanity had reached a remarkable turning point. A plant once used in carefully controlled spiritual settings had become an international industry capable of shaping politics, trade, and entire economies. Modern science has revealed something ancient smokers could never have understood. Nicotine is one of the most addictive, naturally occurring chemicals humans regularly consume. When nicotine enters the bloodstream, it reaches the brain within seconds, triggering the release of neurotransmitters associated with reward, attention, and temporary feelings of pleasure. Repeated exposure changes how the brain responds, making dependence increasingly likely. Yet ancient tobacco use looked very different from today's patterns. Archaeological evidence and historical records suggest many indigenous societies used tobacco far less frequently and often in ceremonial contexts, rather than as an all-day habit. The plant itself was also genetically different from many modern commercial varieties, which have been selectively bred over centuries for higher yields and specific nicotine characteristics. That distinction matters. While tobacco has ancient origins, the industrial production and mass marketing of cigarettes are relatively recent developments. The global smoking epidemic that emerged during the 19th and 20th centuries was driven as much by manufacturing, advertising, and distribution as by the plant itself. The story of smoking, then, is not just about biology. It's about culture, technology, commerce, and the choices societies make over time. So when did ancient humans start smoking? The most honest answer is that no single moment marks the beginning. Humans have lived with fire for hundreds of thousands of years, but the strongest evidence for intentionally using tobacco reaches back roughly 12,000 years, when Ice Age hunter-gatherers in North America were already collecting wild tobacco. By around 3,000 years ago, archaeological discoveries leave little doubt that smoking tobacco with pipes had become an established practice in parts of the Americas. Meanwhile, civilizations elsewhere developed their own traditions of burning fragrant plants and resins for worship, healing, and ceremony, even though tobacco remained completely unknown to them. That makes smoking one of humanity's most fascinating cultural inventions. It did not appear everywhere at once. It emerged through observation, experimentation, and generations of accumulated knowledge before eventually spreading across the globe after contact between the old and new worlds. The next time you see smoke rising into the air, it's worth remembering that the story behind it began long before written history. From Ice Age campsites to sacred temples, from carved stone pipes to global trade routes, a single breath of smoke connects thousands of years of human curiosity, belief, discovery, and consequence. Few everyday habits carry a history quite as ancient or as transformative as that.